And joining us now, Dr. Rich Bowden, environmental educator, award-winning environmental educator here. So tell us about the Bousson facility here.
Sure, Dwayne. I don't know all the exact details and dates of things like that, but the general story I can tell you, and I think that's the most important piece. But this property here was owned by the Bousson family. I think it was late 1800s, early 1900s. Apparently they lived in New York, and this was kind of a summer home. They would come out and visit. And eventually they abandoned the property for a variety of reasons. But somewhere around the 20s, I believe, Allegheny acquired the property and took it over, and since that time it's been a chunk of land that we use for research and teaching.
So now we're standing right here beside a creek, but you told me, and I didn't realize this because I remember coming camping here when I was probably 10 years old, you know, approaching 50 years ago. But there was a dam here, and this was like a mill kind of a thing?
There was, there were many mill ponds at that time because, as you would be aware, there's a lot of hydropower was the way to go. So farmers needed timber, so you had to have a mill somewhere, and it was water powered, or harvesting grains, grinding it up, you needed mill power. So there was a dam that was located just down here, maybe 50 feet or so. And at the time that the college acquired it, that dam was operative, and this was a pond. In fact, we're standing about where our head is, would have been about the depth of water, and there would have been water up over our head. Then in the 1970s, somewhere there, apparently some members of the college got a little concerned of liability issues and decided that the dam should be removed so that no one should get hurt. So I'm told that on a graduation day for Allegheny College, when no one was out here,
everybody was distracted with graduation ceremony.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The dam was removed, and essentially no one was told. And then some faculty members and alums and just graduating students came out here for their parties, and there was no more pond. It was a big mud pit. But what we see over in this section to your left, Dwayne, and we'll step up there later, is that soil that you see is a feature of the landscape now. Remember, that was lake bottom, but that's all soil that eroded from upstream where there are still active farms. It's not really coming down so much anymore, but back in the late 1800s, when this was very active farmland, almost all of the forest was removed. In spring and fall, when there were no plants on the field, that soil was eroding down into the streams, into the small streams, eventually into this stream, and carried here, and then it stopped at the dam here. So this sediment backed up. So there's 6-7 feet of soil that has built up, and all that soil came from upstream.
Is that going to be like really good fertile soil, or is that going to be soil that nothing's going to grow in? I mean, to me, it looks like everything wants to grow here. Look, that's what it looks like.
It's incredibly fertile. Think, the soil that moved was the stuff that came off the top, so the best soil.
I know when we did our French Creek float down trip earlier this year, the creek was very muddy because it had just been a big storm, a day or a day and a half before that or whatever, and so that would have made sense. It was the stuff off the top that was washing down, and so when you have a pond, I mean, it's going to settle there, right? And it's going to sink to the bottom, and so when it's still a pond versus when it's now land after, I mean, is there a different? I get the whole safety thing. I get that, but if I wanted to grow something, there's something that's going to work really well in that former pond location. Something that I may want to plant there for down the road.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sure. But again, thinking that this was the upper portion of soil that eroded, in little bits down into little rivulets and little tiny streams, and eventually here into little sugar. And it'll flow downstream. This was the best soil coming off many of the farms, and to this day, probably one of the biggest water quality impediments to streams here in Crawford County is the sediments that are driven into the stream during the time when there are no plants on the field. One
thing is, we were just getting set up here. I noticed a real interesting. I can see like layers of rock coming down through the stream here. What's going on with that? What does that tell us?
Okay, well, I'm not the geologist, and you got to get the geologist here at some point to come out and chat with you. But we're looking at old ocean bottom here, and so we have a lot of slate. So we're getting down now to bedrock, and you can see that here. So the stream has cut down into its original layer at this point. So this is the old stream channel to some degree. In reality, over that direction, about 120 feet or so, is where the stream used to flow. But when the dam was put in place and the stream cut through, it changed the course, and it took it down that way. But yeah, what we're looking at is the bedrock and the shale that is down here below, which is very characteristic of the bedrock in this region, and the flat stones, and they make really great skipping stones. And if we have a chance later, we'll give it a shot.
Skip a stone. Well, what kind of things are we going to see here today when we're looking around the facility?
Well, what I want to have a chance to chat with you about are some of the research activities that we've had here on the forest that have been going on, some of which have been going on for a long time. One experiment I'll describe in a little bit, some salamander research conducted by Professor Scott Wissinger has been going on for over 3 decades, and I've got some acid rain and climate change experiments I've been looking at for almost 3 decades as well. So there's some really long-term experiments that have been going on that are informing us about the way the forest works and the role of forests in mitigating some human challenges to the ecosystems.
Very good. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing those things.
Okay, let's go.
All right, good. So we're here on the spot where the old pond used to be, and now we have some smaller pond. Looks like now that one's can't be more than looks like about a 50-foot circle there maybe.
Yeah, that's about it, Dwayne. So first, yeah, we moved out of the stream and we're up onto what had been the old lake bottom or pond bottom here, and you can see over there. If you turn, you can see just the remnants of the old dam there.
Yep.
With here when you were in Boy Scouts. So here's the sediments that we're standing on, and imagine that 7 feet down is where the original land bottom was here before a pond was put in place, and these sediments eroded from upstream. But it's provided an ability for us to do some studies and to teach. So Bousson is a teaching and research facility for the college. There's no management conducted here. We could do that, but it would be done in an educational or experimental form. It wouldn't be logged for revenue generation per se. But a couple of things you're seeing here, you pointed out the pond over here. It's always a fun place to come and listen. You just heard a bullfrog croaking over there.
He wanted to get on the show. He wanted to get his voice.
Absolutely, and I think he did.
Yeah,
I hope Jeff got him. And then covered with duckweed on there. But these ponds were built by Scott Wissinger, 30 plus years ago when he first came to Allegheny College as a professor. He was conducting acid rain research, and he had several ponds. There's one here, there's one over here, and a few others up the way here. A couple of them have since eroded away. But early in his career, he was doing a lot of work in these ponds. But he still uses this place, and these funny little metal fences that you see here are part of some long-standing research he's been conducting, and that's on salamanders in this area. So in the spring, he and his students are incredibly busy. These fences are put in place around these ponds and maintained, and there's in spring essentially no plants in here, but that's the time that salamanders breed. So they are looking to get into the water for breeding. So around or along the fence, Scott will place a number of small little holes in the ground and put in those usually like a yogurt container. And the salamanders come running up against the fence, realize they can't get through, and they go zipping along the rest of the fence trying to find a way to get to the water because they know it's there, and they're oblivious to anything except finding a mate, and they fall into those little things. And then Scott and his students come out here about daybreak for a week or two during spring and pull the salamanders out. They count them, they identify them, and he's been doing that now for about 30 years. And the reason for doing that is globally there's been a decline in amphibians. So there's a lot of concern, still a lot unknown as to why that is. Some attribute it at least partially to climate change. It could be to use of pesticides in the environment, land use change, loss of wetlands. We've lost about 50% of all of our wetlands, for example. So there's probably myriad factors that are controlling or dictating those declines in amphibians. So as an aquatic ecologist, Scott has been very interested in amphibians, so he's been monitoring these for a long time. I think he hasn't seen any major changes here in these numbers over that time, but at some point you get him on the show. That's a good question to ask him.
I heard everything you said, and I'm thinking about, okay, it's mating season, and so nobody pays that attention to anything else except mating season. It's like, isn't that funny? It's not just salamanders. There's humans and deer, and everybody else does the same thing.
Absolutely.
So the big picture of that is, it's too soon to tell. I mean, is there really a decline that they're seeing, or is you can figure out why?
Well, nature's diverse. In some places could see some declines, some could see some increases. What we know is globally there are declines in many, many different amphibians. Scott has been looking primarily at the amphibians in this area, the salamanders in particular in this region, and has not been, as far as I know, has not been seeing any big changes, but we better check with him at some point too.
Are there any salamanders around this area that are very unique that aren't, that you don't find in other places, that sort of thing?
No, I'm not the best person to answer that. We have a number of species that are here, and I've seen a number of them here on our property. That's not a field I'm
several
too
times,
in-depth on.
and I ask you that several times this spring. I've seen these bright orange ones, maybe about this big, and it seems like there are a lot of places not too far from a creek or from a wetland area, whatever.
Right.
I've seen a lot of those this year.
Yep, those will be newts. Those will be the juvenile stage of adults, and an important piece is they require moist environments, okay, based on their physiology. So they have to live in those moist areas. After rain, you often find them. In the spring, you'll find them. Often come midsummer or late summer when it's really dry, it's very hard to find them because in the forest where they will live, they're going to bury down under decaying logs, deeper in the soil to find a place that's going to stay cooler and moister so they don't dehydrate.
There's that frog jumping in on the show again.
Yeah, and his friend just joined in from that side too.
One to take over. Let me ask you a generic question. Okay, so an area that was farmed, I'm making this up, 100 years ago or whatever.
That's about right.
You stop farming it, and I mean, it looks like a forest. Is there like a, okay, the glacier came through here. I'm sure glacier wiped out all the forest, 10,000 years ago.
I was here, yep, I saw it.
But is there like this area, the forest comes back in 50 years, another area, that's hotter or that it's wetter or that it's what, is there something about Crawford County that seems like if you stop mowing something, pretty soon trees are springing up there? Am I right? Am I right about that? Seems like that happens in my yard, if I stop mowing one corner of the yard.
Yep, and everything's going to jump up, and that's exactly what's been happening here in Crawford County. In fact, with students in a number of labs and some projects, we have been looking at land use. In fact, we've been doing a number of projects with the Foundation for Sustainable Forestry and looking at the land use history of many of their properties. And what we typically find in this area using geographic information systems is that you go back in time and you look at the earliest aerial photographs in the 1930s from this area, and probably something like 75% of Crawford County was in agriculture. Very little forest, a little bit of scrubland. But you look now, and it's pretty much reversed those numbers. Okay, so we're well over half of the county or more is forested, and the farms are being abandoned. Now, it's a function of agriculture has shifted west, the tough economics for small-scale dairy.
A small farm making a go, but that's a very tough thing.
It's hard for them to make a go. So the good news is we have fertile soils in this region. We have a good growing season. We have sufficient moisture that the forest comes back. But, and maybe when we get up into the woods more, we can talk about what the forest will come back to, because it doesn't come back to exactly the same forest that was here post-glacial, 400 years ago at the time of European settlement. There were certainly natives, Americans who were living in this region, primarily from the Seneca Nation in this region, and they would have used the landscape and the resources here. But the trees we see here in terms of species assemblage are many of the same ones that would have been here, but the numbers of them are drastically changed. In fact, there are also signals in the soil that tell it's changed. There's what we refer to as a land use legacy. So we can look at some places, and we will today in the forest, and we can tell this area had been plowed or this area had been left behind perhaps as a woodlot or a field. So there's some pretty good indicators both on the soil and the kinds of species that we see that'll tell us what was happening in this forest a century ago.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing about that. Let's go check it out.
Okie doke.
Well, we moved into the woods here, Rich, and that's a little different environment. But your helper Alex Spiro here is working on something. What are we working on?
Well, this is part of a long-term experiment, Dwayne, looking at essentially acid rain, a topic that's barely in the news anymore, except if you're in sort of the scientific community. So the quick story is, you would remember back in the 1970s, Sure. It was all the rage, it was in the news. The 1980s, lots and lots of studies and all sorts of stuff out there saying the forests are all going to melt with the acid, and others saying it's not going to matter at all. Well, after was a decade of scientific research, it showed, well, there's some really serious effects on lakes and forests, and we need to do something about it. So in fact, Congress then passed some legislation to reduce sulfur deposition and nitrogen deposition to reduce acid inputs, because those are the main precursors causing acid rain. The sulfur comes primarily from burning coal, and the nitrogen comes from any sort of large-scale combustion process, cars, industry, power generation. The challenge, though, is that the system, though, even though we passed the law, has never completely dealt with the acid rain issue. And that is because it dealt primarily with sulfur, but it didn't do much with nitrogen. And primarily because that's a political hot potato. It's pretty hard to tell people, don't drive your cars. In fact, you and I helped make acid rain as we drove out here 10 miles from campus here to the research forest. So nitrogen was left out of the equation. And the forest ecologists at the time were saying, you know, sulfur in excess is bad in the forest, but nitrogen is much more of a critical nutrient out here, because it's usually the nutrient that you add to forests that will make them grow better. You know, from working around farms and on your lawn, that's the fertilizer you normally add. So plants are very responsive, and ecosystems very responsive to nitrogen. But we didn't really deal with that. So the research community has continued to look at this over time to see what these long-standing inputs are. Now, what we do know is that legislation had good effect. It's reduced the amount of acids coming into many of our ecosystems across the country. It's reduced sulfur deposition and nitrogen deposition. But two things. One is all that nitrogen we added decades ago is still here. Secondly, we're still adding it. So the problem hasn't disappeared. Okay. So the work that we're doing here is part of a long-standing study which was initiated in 1993, where we dosed the plots in the forest with high levels of nitrogen to mimic long-term, what we call chronic nitrogen deposition. So what Alex is doing here is part of our routine application. 6 times a year we apply a known amount of nitrogen here, about 10 times the dose that comes in from the atmosphere, which is the primary source. From the atmosphere we get the equivalent of about 10 pounds per acre, which doesn't seem like a lot, but to a forest, that's a big addition. Okay. We had about 100, so that's a lot, but what we're trying to do is substitute amount for time, trying to ask what might it be like a century from now if the forest continues getting much, more and more of this nitrogen. So Alex has just filled up the backpack sprayer. He's finished 2 of the plots. He's about to hoist the backpack up, and we'll get to watch him as he's applying the fertilizer here.
While you're getting set up here, let me ask you a little bit. You're from the eastern part of the state. Did I hear that right?
Yes, I'm from Lewisburg, Pennsylvania.
Compare and contrast. What's it like here in the western part of the state, the hometown for you?
Well, it's the forests here are pretty similar, but we don't have the same ridge and valley aspect of topography in the western side of Pennsylvania here. But yeah, it's very similar to home, but in a lot of ways, ecologically, it's very different as well.
So how'd you get interested in this research?
I've always been interested in forests and forest ecology, and I took a couple classes, 2 semesters in a row with Rich, and I just decided that I wanted to do research this summer, and here I am doing it.
So you've got a couple years to go at Allegheny. Yep. Are you thinking ahead yet?
I don't know. I really want to do something with rainforest ecology, so probably grad school in the future, but that's about it.
Well, let me get out of your way, let you get going with the research here.
All right. Thank you.
There we go.
The strap is so messed up. Put it back down. Sorry about that.
Rich, I see an area where Alex is walking there that's marked off with some pipes and some orange flags. Is there a particular, how'd you decide that spot? How'd you decide the size it should be? Anything in particular that makes that choice happen?
Yeah, science is and experiments are always a balance between objective and subjective kinds of criteria. So the objective criteria is we wanted a set of 3 different locations right in this area. We have 3 control sites, 3 fertilized plots, and they're in pretty close proximity within, say, 2 or 3 acres of land here. So we wanted them to be somewhat similar to the kind of forest and forest composition in this area. So each of the 3 control plots and the 3 fertilized plots, as we call them, were selected to be pretty similar in terms of species composition, topography, layout, etc. So that way, when we're experimentally comparing effects of unfertilized plots to the acid rain fertilized plots, we can detect differences.
So you mentioned before about this area being farmland for many, many years before, and it's not been farmland for 100 years, give or take. And I'm looking around and I see oak trees, I see maple trees, I see evergreens, it looks like some hemlocks. And so is this what happens whenever you just stop, whenever you stop farming around this area?
It depends on kind of where you are. That's kind of a standard scientific response, right? It depends. You've heard that often, right? Okay, so what does it depend on? Well, we can look here and get an idea of what the land use history had been and what that legacy is, because one thing we see a lot of black cherry. Okay, these trees here, very dark bark, kind of flaky on them. Professor Milt Ostrovsky describes that as sort of burnt cornflakes, which I've always liked his analogy on that. Those plants, those trees can only survive under conditions of very high light. They cannot survive in the shade or even a little bit of shade. So the prevalence of lots of these trees, and there's even more when we get up to the other experiment that we'll describe, tells us that at one point this land was very open. Okay. So one clue is this was not always forest. It had to be a period when it was probably devoid of trees. Now we can look for another signal, and that is on the ground. So if we look here, we see a pit right over there, a mound on either side. We can look across this landscape and see pits and mounds and more pits and more mounds, and we call that pit and mound topography. Those pits and mounds come from natural tree fall. So a tree falls over.
So that's left over from the uprooting of the tree?
Bingo, that's it. You know exactly. You've seen many of them in the woods. So that pile of soil goes up into the air, and then the roots rot, and the soil moves its way back down, but it stays lots in a pile, and the place where the root ball came out, that creates a pit.
Dip. Okay.
There's the pit. So the prevalence here of lots of pits and mounds tells us that this was never plowed, because this area was in agriculture for about 1830 to 1930 or so during its heyday. A farmer would have plowed this once or twice every year, so several hundred passes would have smoothed this all out and made it much flatter. Okay, but because we have pits and mounds, it tells us it was never plowed. So this land here could have been a woodlot that was pretty open, or it could have been pasture.
Okay.
And it's really hard to tell that difference over time because people tended not to keep records on their private property.
I remember going to a talk one time, and I'm trying to remember where the talk was. But it's oaks like to be the top tree, and then and you mentioned the cherry. The cherry likes to have sunlight, so maybe does that mean that cherry trees were maybe older than some of these other ones that look like maybe might be a little bit taller than the cherry trees?
Not necessarily older, but what would have happened here is when this land was abandoned from farming, there would have been some cherry trees nearby. And those seeds came in, they were blown in, or birds were eating the cherry seeds, dropped the seeds down, the seeds sprouted, and they produce lots of seeds, and those seeds will go flying up. Those seedlings will fly up in a hurry. Remember, their job, if you will, is they have to grow fast to get over everything around them. If they get shaded, they lose. So they only have one way to live, and that's to grow really fast and get up into the canopy. So if we could get up there somehow, we would find that most of the trees up on the top, those oaks would be up there as well, and some of these maples, but every one of these cherries has to have its crown.
It wants to be up there in the sunlight.
It's got to be the top dog.
I remember talking to a timber person one time about that topic, and why don't you want this nice big tree that's in my yard? Well, there's no other trees around, and it's just big and fat, and it's not very tall. It doesn't have to grow very tall, right?
No.
It doesn't have to go tall for the sunlight. So here they're all kind of fighting for the sunlight, right?
That's right. Yeah, and in the yard, those trees will grow out wide, which makes for a beautiful ornamental tree, but not a good forestry tree. These trees here have big, tall trunks with no branches. From a forestry perspective, they would be very valuable. But again, we're not harvesting this. We use this place for research and teaching.
So what Alex is working on there, has there been, granted it's been a while, and this is going to be a long-term project, right? But are you learning anything so far? Is anything changes coming along? Yeah,
we have. In fact, just a few weeks ago, we presented a paper on lots of pieces of this research at an international soils conference that was held up in Quebec City. And the story that's emerging has been an interesting one and a pretty important one. And the bottom line of what we found is several years ago, 3 or 4, one of our Allegheny students for her senior project measured the soils in here down to about 3 feet in depth and looked at the carbon content. And what she found is that the carbon content is increasing. Carbon, why do we care about carbon? Well, half of organic matter is carbon. Organic matter is like this tree and these leaves and these branches. They're primarily organic matter. And then half of that weight is carbon. We're also interested from the climate change perspective because we're concerned with the amount of carbon increasing in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. So globally, forest ecologists are looking at forests and how much carbon they contain in the living trees and in soil. So we measured the carbon and found it's increasing. So at first pass, we would say, oh, that's kind of good. This forest is storing more carbon. How is that happening? Well, first guess might be, well, the trees are growing bigger and they're making more leaves and they're making more roots, and that stuff decomposes and it leaves some of that organic matter behind, and that organic matter contains carbon, so that's leading to the increase. Well, we measured tree growth in these plots and trees aren't growing faster. Even after almost 20 years, they're not growing any faster, even though we fertilize them. We looked at the roots. There's some increase in roots, so maybe that's part of the answer. But then we've had additional studies with other Allegheny students since then, and what they have learned is that the leaves here are decomposing more slowly. So we put out some bags filled with leaves. We measured them for over the course of an entire year, came back, collected them, weighed them, and found that in the leaves that were placed on these fertilized plots, they didn't decompose as fast. And that would help lead to the increase in carbon in these soils. The organic matter that contains carbon is left behind, and it filters its way into soil, and it stays there. Okay, so far that all sounds good. But then the important piece comes out and we ask, well, what's the long-term consequence of that? Does it really matter? Well, we've been doing some really neat work with some colleagues up in University of Toronto who study soil chemistry. The woman that we work with, Myrna Simpson, is probably one of the international leaders in soil chemistry, and she has found that the carbon compounds in soil show reduced evidence of decay. So that stuff is not decomposing. Well, let's think about what this tree needs to live here, right? So it's up in the sunlight, up in the canopy to get sun. It needs moisture, and this is Crawford County. We know we get plenty of rain and moisture most of the time. Those things aren't limited. We have, relatively speaking, pretty productive soils. Trees grow well. You said that before, when we know trees grow back following agricultural abandonment. But they still need a replenishing supply of nutrients, and that comes because most of these leaves on the ground here decompose. The nutrients are released, they go back in the soil, plants send out their roots, they take them back up. So these trees are master recyclers. So even though the leaves fall to the ground containing nutrients, the trees take them back up again. So importantly for a tree, it needs a number of nutrients, certainly nitrogen, like what we're adding, so it is a nutrient, but they need calcium, magnesium, potassium, and others as well. So a couple years ago, a student who's now a graduate student at Syracuse University studied calcium, magnesium, and potassium in soils and found that those cations were reduced in soil. So think about this now. Adding nitrogen reduces decomposition. Less decomposition, fewer nutrients. Now we ask the question, and we don't know the answer, what's the long-term prognosis to a forest when you're pulling away one of its nutrient sources?
Wow, interesting.
Complicated picture.
What would you guess? What would your guess be?
I think over time we would probably see a signal here. This is not the only place it's been observed. Others have found that, as Alex is doing here, as you apply more nitrogen to soils in experimental settings, we see a reduction in cation availability. Those are the nutrients, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and others are called cations. It refers to the charge of the ion that's there. So if over time there's a reduction, we may see a reduction in the growth of this forest. When will that be? It's hard to say. Remember, we're applying now for almost 20 years, 10 times the amount that's normally seen. So we're projecting what this forest might look like in a century from now. right? So those who
I was
care.
guessing you were going to say something else. I was guessing you were going to say it was going to change the composition of the forest to make it something else. You know, not big, tall hardwood trees, but it would make something else grow there.
And I'd have to give you some good points on your essay for that, because yes, sugar maple, it has a high requirement for calcium. So if there are declines in calcium, sugar maple here would likely not do so well. The oaks might do fine and the cherries might do fine, but the sugar maple might have a hard time here if calcium stocks decline.
Let me ask you one other question about the dips and the humps. Obviously, when it rains hard, the water's going to lay in the low spots. Does that change things going down the road? Does that make a wetter spot that makes the tree next door, you know, more at risk of falling over down the road?
It could. If you look quite a few of these trees, you'll see them growing on either the flat areas or up on the mounds. Typically, you don't see them in the pits.
Okay.
You're right. Those things get very wet, and in some places, they're very good habitats for amphibians, as we were talking about earlier. In the spring, they retain some water, and salamanders need what we call a vernal pool. They need that springtime condition where they can come in, mate, lay their eggs, the eggs hatch, off go the young ones, and then they can spread back to this terrestrial landscape. But they need those conditions, and there are vernal pools that, this time of year you wouldn't even see them, it's too dry, but some of those pits can become very good mating places for amphibians.
Interesting. So I guess if you're a tree and you're picking a spot to grow up on, maybe you want to be not too far from one of those things, but you want to be right on top of it either. You want to be back where you're going to still get some moisture that you need, but not right smack right next door to it.
Yeah, it's you need just the right amount for you. Now every tree has slightly different requirements for many things. Nutrients, I mentioned, sugar maple needs a lot of calcium. Some plants can do very well in very wet conditions, like sycamore does very well. Silver maple, typically find them, say, along the shores of French Creek, but then you get into the upper elevations, other trees will do much better, like these maples and the cherries, and there's some oak in here as well. They require some drier soil. You had asked Dwayne before, brought up the notion of the forest regrowing here and thinking about composition. And I mentioned that black cherry needs a lot of light.
Okay.
So again, the one of the legacies, what we can see here is the composition of this forest, even though we can say, hey, farms are gone, no more pasture in here, this is forest, and it's good, and that is a good thing. So we do have resilient forests. But if we ask what should it be, that's sort of an interesting question. It depends on what our objectives are and our perspectives. What's important to know is that the trees that you see here were here 400 years ago and 200 years ago, but not in these amounts. This is a different composition than what used to be. See, probably this forest was more like the hemlocks, which we can see down in the distance over there.
Near the creek?
Right, closer to the creek, and you look through there about 100 yards, you can see a lot more hemlock. There would have been a lot of beech. We have some beech here.
I did see one or two walking up here, yep.
Yep, so there'll be some beech. But those species would have been much more dominant if we had been here before European settlement of this region. This forest right now, where we're standing, is on its way to, all things being equal, it's going to be mostly a sugar maple forest. If you look at ground level, or a little bit above us, what do we see in the understory? Well, there's a sugar maple right there. It's about 30 feet tall. There's one about 12 feet tall, another one about 10 or so. You don't see a single cherry tree in here. Now, if we were here in April doing this show, you would look at the ground, you would see lots and lots and lots of little cherry seedlings, because the seeds would have fallen, they would have sprouted, been loaded with cherry seedlings.
But now they're getting too much shade and they can't
survive.
Take off.
Yeah, they're essentially starved of light. They just don't get enough light to survive, and that's of course their energy source. So there's virtually no young black cherry trees to be seen anywhere around here.
Let me ask you one more tree question, and we can move on and talk about some other stuff. But I'm seeing what looks like maybe a branch off of an ash tree right there. Mm-hmm. When we talked a few years back, ash, they're affected by an issue. Are there virgins, species within the ash that are going to make it through this thing or not? And I ask you that because in my yard, for whatever reason, a lot of ash trees around the yard, and they're all going, it's like they're still alive, but they're less and less leaves every year, and I'm wondering, that might fall in the house. I wonder when I should cut that down. But little baby ones are coming up all over the place. So what can I learn anything from that? Does that are the little ones some different breed that's going to survive or not?
Well, we can hope, and that's sort of where we are right now. And, a lot of the Forest Service people are conducting a lot of research on ash trees and the emerald ash borer. That's the little bright green insect that's native to Asia. Came over here. It was introduced. It probably came over on shipping pallets. So as we shipped goods from Asian countries, it came on pallets and it came here just as we ship things across the sea in the other direction. And it inadvertently came here, and it's been now wiping out our ash trees. And they're in trouble. It's now it's been in Crawford County for a few years. It's now right in town here. I just noticed on campus the other day, there's a really pretty ash tree outside one of the dorms, and it's now dying. It'll be coming down soon. I was biking home the other day and up at the Crawford County Fairgrounds, and a couple big ash trees were just cut recently. And you can tell it was from the borer because you look and you see all these little wormholes just under the bark. So what's happening, to explain what's going on in your yard, is the adult insect lays its eggs inside the bark. The young emerge, and then they chew their way through the living portion of the tree, because if we come to this tree here, just underneath this bark is the only living portion of the tree.
That's where all the growth is taking.
That's right. All the growth occurs in that outer portion, just underneath the bark. It's called the cambium layer. So that's where the growth is, not in the interior. That can rot away, but it wouldn't affect the life of the tree per se. It will affect strength, but not the life of the tree. So the insect bores into that cambium, and that's its yummy material, just like chewing away on corn on the cob. So it's eating the juicy stuff on the outside, and eventually it eats so much, it stops the flow of water and nutrients from going up the tree, and the flow of sugar going to the rest of the tree. So suddenly the tree can't move its nutrients and water up, it can't move its sugars, it's the food that it's making up in the leaves to the rest of the tree, and the tree will die. But it likes that portion underneath. The young things, like some of these ash that you were looking at here, it doesn't affect those nearly so much. Okay, so there's not enough of the yummy stuff there. So they could be okay as seedlings for a while, but as they get bigger, they're gonna get attacked.
Okay. Okay.
So we're about to lose most of our ash.
So if I'm thinking about some new trees in the yard, I probably shouldn't be thinking about the ash trees. Try and get maybe something else to be taken in place if I can. Get maple and...
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Get somebody to cut those trees now before they end up on your roof, and find another replacement.
I'm worried more about them coming through the roof.
That too.
Because they're pretty big, you know, and yeah,
that's a good consideration.
They could make a dent, yeah.
Many landowners in this region who are conducting forest operations or property are taking out and selecting for the ash and taking them out, and that probably makes sense because they're going to come down. So if you know they're going to come down and you want to make some money off those, now has been a good time. Many of the forest consulting foresters and loggers in this area have been doing that. That's the right plan.
Well, what are the research things that are going on here that we can take a look at?
Well, we're going to head up here to another project we've been working on. It's a climate change related project, although some of the findings there have informed us what we find in this acid rain. So we're going to march off this way, Dwayne, and we'll look at another long-term study that we conduct here. And it's part of a big network of studies that we conduct across the country and even across the globe.
Super, super. Let's go.
Let's go.
Now, Rich, I always thought having a fire going in the forest was a bad thing. What's going on?
Yeah, if this was California or Colorado, we wouldn't be doing this. Even I'm smart enough to know not to do that. Well, I'll jump in a little bit to exactly what he's doing, but the bottom line is he's weeding that plot, and I'll tell you how and why in a little bit. But first, the context. So we're sitting in the middle of an experiment that we refer to as DIRT, and it stands for Detritus Input and Removal Treatments. This is actually part of a very large network of study sites around this country, from Massachusetts, northern Michigan, coastal Oregon, here, a few other places as well. American Southwest, some places in Europe and China now are part of this network. Basically, it's a study to understand the role of forests in absorbing carbon and helping to mitigate climate change, okay, to reduce global warming. The rationale for this began 25 years ago when forest managers were addressing to the foresters on the ground and saying, hey, can you do some things in your management strategy to help increase the amount of carbon in soil? And they were doing this with some good information in their head. What they had learned from researchers and their own college classes is If we look across this forest right now, we tend to be rather focused on the trees, and as humans I think that's pretty natural. We see all these trees, and half the dry weight of all these trees contains carbon, so they're sucking up a lot of carbon, and every day they're photosynthesizing and taking more. But they store a lot of that, or at least a portion of that carbon, in soil. So if we look at this forest and we look at the amount of carbon stored in the trees, there's 3 times as much carbon stored in soil. So soil is holding an enormous amount of carbon. So it made sense for the policy people to tell the managers, or at least ask of them, can you store more carbon in soil? Well, that kind of got translated to the researchers who said, well, you know, we don't even understand what controls carbon in soil. What we do know is the carbon in this forest, in this soil right now, has been accumulating since the glaciers were here last, 10,000 years ago. So while we've regrown this forest in 100 years since this farmland was abandoned, and it's regrown to forest, it's taken 10,000 years for the current amount of carbon in the soil to get there. So there may be 3 times as much, but it's taken 100 times longer to get there. We also have not understood how much comes from leaves as they decompose, how much comes from decomposing roots. So we set up this experiment. The initial one was a long time ago in Wisconsin, 60 years ago. And then when I used to live in Massachusetts and work there, we set up some plots there to study it. I moved to Pennsylvania, set up this, and since I've worked with colleagues around the country, and we've set up this project in a variety of locations. What we have are plots where, like the one that you see Alex flaming right now, that has a plastic trench around it. That goes down about 4 feet and keeps out all the roots from the outside. We also keep a screen on it to keep out the leaves. Then over there is a plot with a screen on it. That just keeps out the leaves. And then we have control plots. Okay. We have some plots where we take the leaves off one plot and transfer it to another. We call that a double litter plot. Then we have some where we just keep out the roots. So we have 5 different treatments on here. Here's what we've learned so far. In one of the treatments where we take leaves from one plot and apply it to the other, we've done that since 1991. So it's been going on for a long time, coming on 3 decades here pretty soon. We found, well, the expectation was you add more leaves, the leaves partially rot, some of the carbon is left behind. That carbon will go into soil, it will increase, and we'll store more carbon. And that's what we might expect if somehow the managers in this forest could increase the growth rate of this forest, make more leaves, make the trees grow bigger, faster. Well, after we measured these soils after 20 years and found there was no increase in carbon, even though we doubled that input. That was a shock. And it wasn't only here. We found that in Massachusetts. We're finding that in Michigan. We're about to, just this spring, we sampled the ones in Oregon. What we're finding is soils are very slow to store carbon. It just doesn't happen fast. The importance of that is if we're coming out as human beings asking this forest, hey look, we're putting CO2 in the atmosphere from fossil fuel combustion and land use change, can you somehow change the way you work to put more carbon in the ground? The forest is telling us, not really. Now, in some cases it can do that. We do have one site in Hungary that's been showing some increases, but we think that's because it's a very dry site and decomposition is slow right off the bat. It does work if you're replanting a forest where there's never been one, reforestation of abandoned lands perhaps. But on an intact forest like this that's probably or perhaps always been somewhat forested, maybe a long time woodlot for the local farmer, it's very hard to increase the amount of carbon. So what's Alex doing over here? Well, because this is an experiment and it's not meant to directly mimic nature. In this case, we want to keep off all the leaves from going into the ground and all the roots from going in. So we're starving this soil of carbon. What's happened here is because there's no leaves or branches on the ground, mosses have come in, and they love to grow on these exposed soils. I love mosses, but we don't want them here experimentally. They're adding carbon to the soil in ways that we can't quantify, and you can't kill it with an herbicide because they're what we call a non-vascular plant. They don't respond to herbicides. So we have 2 ways we can reduce their amount here on the soil. One is, as you see, we burn them, and it takes a number of applications to burn it off every few years, and then sometimes from some hand picking to get it off the site. So that's why Alex is out there with the super duper hot dog cooker.
Yeah, right. I was thinking s'mores. I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah, some good bratwurst and a bun. I'm starting to sound pretty good right now. The other thing we have found on this from this experiment here and the other sites around the country, Dwayne, is these sites, for example, these plots where we have no more inputs, their carbon content is reduced about 50%.
Wow.
So in 20 years, half the carbon that was here is gone. Now that's important because it tells us that you can lose that carbon in a hurry. That organic matter can disappear from soil. So while we learned on one side of the equation you can't increase the amount very well, we've also learned you can lose it in a hurry. Probably like your money in the bank, right? It's easy to lose your savings, but it's really hard to build it up in the bank.
So I mean, no, I'm jumping ahead in my brain here. So that tells if we're losing forest, that's a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's always that societal balance. In this region, people needed food, so no one came in here knowingly and said, I hate forests, let's cut them down. But you wanted to live, you needed to eat. And how did you grow food? Well, people don't eat wood. You've got to take out the forest and then put in agriculture. In this country, agriculture has shifted west, where it makes more sense. For agriculture, much more productive. So it's been abandoned here in this region.
So let me ask you, as a property owner, if I've got some forest on my property, I can still manage that forest and maybe get some value to replace my broken truck or whatever, and keep it going. Is there like a really good way to think about that to help me make my decisions on that?
There are some very good forest consultants in this region, and what I usually tell people, Dwayne, is most people have very good intentions for their forests, but very few people have ever taken a forest ecology class and certainly aren't trained foresters. And forests are not the same as gardens. They are long-lived. I mean, for example, one common misperception is that, oh, I see those big black cherries, they must be the oldest trees in the forest. They could be the same age as that maple tree right there, even though they're a lot bigger. It's just like looking at a class of high school seniors. Some are on the basketball team because they're tall, and some are not because they're not so tall. Some trees will grow faster than others. So size alone is not a determinant of the age of a tree. I use that example to say that forests are complicated. And simply coming out, for example, as a landowner and say, I'm going to cut the biggest and let all the little ones get bigger, doesn't always happen. Just like taking the tall people off a basketball team doesn't make the shorter people grow any taller.
Maybe that biggest one might be the one that's the most healthiest and it's got the best genetics, and I want that one to, so maybe take some of the smaller ones and leave that really big one to make healthier babies down the road.
Right, bingo. In fact, we often say in the state of Pennsylvania, mostly what we do is we take the best and leave the rest. So we take out those really good genes, whereas a better form of forestry is what we often call is worst first forestry. Take out the worst ones and then let the residual trees get bigger, better, faster, because actually later on, ecologically they'll be more valuable, and economically they'll be more valuable. Those big trees will accrue more value faster if you leave them. So later on, you could take out a few trees, make the same amount of money as you might from 10 trees if you're trying to take out a lot of small trees.
I could ask you, I think, about 3 more hours worth of questions here, but we're running out of time. So let me just ask you generically, if I do want to learn more about this kind of stuff, what might be, just for a regular guy like me, what might be a good way to go?
There's a couple organizations in the region you might go to. Actually, in Pennsylvania, we have a lot of good resources. The Foundation for Sustainable Forests works in this region as a nonprofit organization. You could join them, become a member. The Northwest Pennsylvania Woodland Association is an organization comprised of landowners who want to manage their land better and know how to do it. And they're often advised by members of the Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry, from the Game Commission, from other agencies here in the state. You can certainly contact your local forester, in our case Mark Lewis from the Bureau of Forestry, who can come on your property, even if it's 5 acres, and say, here's what you should do. I mean, Mark came to my property and helped me develop a forest management plan. I then had the foundation come in and First Maple Products and conduct forest operations on my own land. So there's a lot of good resources in this area. My missive usually is take advantage of what's out there and don't try to do it on your own.
Well, Rich Bowden, thanks very much for being with us on Crawford County Outdoors. I love it whenever we talk. We'll do it again. We'll do it again.
Of course we will.
And folks at home, thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.